Korean Americans are celebrating 2003 as the 100th anniversary of Korean immigration to the United States. However, looking back to the Korean-American history in 1882, when the U.S. signed a treaty of peace, friendships, and commerce with Korea, allowing each country to exhibit a diplomatic mission in the other countries. From then on, many Korean immigrants live in the United States. They came from the eastern end of the Eurasian landmass. The Korean immigrants came at different times to Hawaii. Although Korean immigrants had different reasons for immigrating to the United States, they had a common goal to earn money, live better life, save money to bring their family in Korea, and someday they want to return their homeland. Therefore, in these presentations, we will explain to you that Korean immigrations to the United States can be divided into three major waves and still had a huge impact and influence in the present day.
안녕하세요. 저는 플로이엠암 입니다. 오늘 우리는 한국 이민, 미국 이야기 같습니다.
Hi everyone, I'm Ploy and this is Ma'am. Today we are going to present to you about the Korean immigrations to the United States. First of all, I think we need to look at the phases of Korean wave to America. 1880 is the first immigrant Korea in the United States. 1903 to 1949 is the first significant wave of Korean immigrations. Next, 1950 to 1964 is the second wave of Korean immigrations. And lastly, since 1965, the third recent wave of Korean immigrations. This graph is the number of Korean immigrations in the United States. Since 1960, immigrations from the Korean Peninsula to the United States had increased dramatically, driven by political, economic, and military relations between South Korea and the United States. As we can see in this graph, 2017 approximately 1 million Korean immigrants. It is the vast majority from South Korea. And after Immigration Act of 1965, it removed restrictions on Asian immigrations to the United States. The Korean immigrants' populations grew significantly. In 2010, it reached a peak of 1.1 million immigrants living in the United States. But in 2017, the Korean immigrants' populations had decreased since 2010, as we can see in this graph. Therefore, it can be said that there are now fewer incentives to immigrate as political economic conditions in the South Korea have improved, and the South Korean government has attempted to attack return migrations through increased economic and business opportunities. Most of Korean immigrations during 2013 to 2017 reside in three states, which are California, New York, and New Jersey. The top four countries with Korean immigrants were Los Angeles County and Orange County in California, Bergen County in New Jersey, and Queens County in New York. So the four countries account for about 29% of the total Korean immigrants populations in the United States. Next, this following chart is the characteristic of Korean immigrants. More than half of Korean immigrants were employed in management, business, science, and art occupations, compared to just 32% of all immigrants and 39% of native, as we can see in this chart. In contrast, fewer Korean immigrants work in natural resources, constructions, and maintenance occupations, as we can see it just only 3%, and productions, transportations, material moving occupations. Next, we're gonna look at the characteristic of the Korean immigrants. Korea are one of the most highly educated ethnic groups in the United States. They are characterized by a high level of economic achievement, entrepreneurial activities, and upward social mobilities. So we need to look at the entrepreneur. The Korea is like 1/3 of Korean immigrants household engage in a self-owned business. With more than 155,000 businesses, Korea ranked third amongst APA after the Chinese and India. But their tendency to enter in businesses is one of the highest among all minority ethnic groups. For instance, the rate of Korean businesses ownership is 71% higher than share of populations, higher of all the major Asian ethnic groups. And because the Korea were so successful, the higher number of Korean immigrants mean the increase on the US economy through the labor market. If the Korean populations increased by twice, national per capita income would grow by 0.1 to 0.2%. However, it will not be the case because it became less attractive to Korean immigrate to US as South Korea has become a powerful economic nation. Next, we need to look at the highly educated. The Korean immigrants have high educational attainment compared to the overall native-born populations because Korean immigrants hold a bachelor degree and graduated on a professional degree. Since educational for them is like very important in Korean society. It is the normal see little children spend all day at school and high school students stay at school more than 12 hours. Next, the value and norm. Korean immigrants, they are like diligence and hard work. In fact, the Korea came to America to replace Chinese after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1862. So let's take a look in the push factor for Korean immigrants to the United States. First is the China and Japan authority. In the earlier period, Korea was under control of China and Japan, which made many politicians refugee immigrants to America. Moreover, they also take the idea of democratics back to Korea as well. For example, Philip Jason. Next, Korean War. After the war, many people fled from both North Korea and South Korea to other countries including China and the United States. And the close military and political tie between South Korea and the US led the majority of immigrants to choose to stay in America. Next is the economic crisis and high rate of unemployment. Due to the lack of natural resources, the unemployment rate is low and being under control of many countries, so that it makes Korean people have less opportunity to work. And lastly, political insecurity and military dictatorships. The political insecurity make the citizens want to be like immigrants for their political freedoms. Especially in North Korea, many Koreans run away from military dictatorships. Moving to the pull factor for Korean immigrants to America, the work opportunities is the most prominent pull factor for Korea to move to America. In 1903 to 1905, 7,000 Korean males moved to Hawaii in hope of finding work in sugar plantations. Around 1960, it is like the lack of job opportunity and political insecurity under military dictatorship prompted many Koreans to immigrate. Next is the education opportunities. Korea is one of the countries that give high value on educate, which make them immigrations to the United States for better educations, especially in the medical branch. Next is the entertainment industry. Hollywood is known as the biggest entertainment industry in the world, which male Korean artists who want to be international star, they become like immigrants to the United States for casting and work. Next is the largest influx of immigrants. 1882, Joseon-United States Treaty. It was the first United States-Korea treaty that was ratified in 1883. The United States and Korea Joseon dynasty established diplomatic relations under 1882. It is the treaty of peace, amity, commerce, and navigation, and the first U.S. diplomatic envoy alive in the Korea in 1883. The treaty established the mutual friendships and mutual assistance in case of attack. Also, it addressed some specific matters such as extraterritorial rights for U.S. citizens in Korea and trade status. The treaty created the first visit of Korea to the Western Hemisphere. Because of the treaty, the appointed minister was sent to the U.S. for a special mission of friendship. Korea-American relations before the ratification of the 1882 Treaty of Peace, Amity, Commerce and Navigation was about the interests of the U.S. in 19th century for protection of the U.S. ships as they sail in Korea water. Also, the potential for trade in Korea was thought to be sufficient since the U.S. merchants had realized a profit with China and even more so with Japan. By the way, in 1883 it was the first Korea delegations to the United States. The New York Times reported that the Korea delegations had arrived in the U.S. presenting their state and appearance. The first official Korea delegation consists of 10 members, led by the Chief Minister Min Young-ik, Vice Minister Hong Yong-sik, and Percival Lowell, who act as the Foreign Secretary and Consular. So the Korea delegations arrived in New York on September 17 in 1883, they having the travel across the country from San Francisco. And the next day they met the American President Arthur at 11 o'clock in the morning. To 1945, many political refugees and intellectuals from Korea studied at universities in many East Coast cities, including Boston University, Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, and New York University. Moving to the second wave of Korea immigrations in 1950 to 1964. The first event is the Korea War. After Korea was liberated from Japanese occupations in 1945, Korea becomes a battleground in the US and Soviet Union power struggle. In 1948, Korea was divided into political entities. South Korea supported by the United States and a communist government in North Korea supported by the Soviet Union. The Korea War in 1950 to 1953, it is like the second wave of Korean immigrants moved to America. What started as an ideological conflict in Cold War period became a national calamity, killing nearly 55,000 people. During this period, approximately 15,000 Korean immigrated to the United States. The McCarran and Walter Acts of 1952. It notified the Asian immigration ban and made Asian immigrants eligible for citizenship. The second wave consists of three groups, which are the Korean wife of American soldiers known as war brides, were often adopted by American family, and around 27,000 people composed of students, businessmen, and intellectuals. To look into more detail of War Bride Act of 1946, it facilitated the immigrations of Korean wife of American servicemen. The War Bride is like the first wave of Korean immigrants who suffered from alienations and cultural barrier. They were isolated from both Korean and American community because most were required to stay on military base or in military facilities. Next is transnational adoptees. This is the second group of immigrants adopt Korean students of mixed ethnic descent. And they were mixed race, they were fatherless, and their mother were treated as a prostitute who has born leisurely impure baby. Many of these Korean students were adopted by Christian family, and in New England, around 151 students were adopted, and 116 were adopted to home in Massachusetts. Next, the Korean students, businessmen, and politicians. Approximately 6,000 Korean students entered the U.S. between 1950 and 1964. Many were professionals who were medical doctor, lawyer, and professor. Although not completely free from segregation and minor racism, these Korean immigrants were well accepted and integrated into American society and becoming like the model of minorities. The last wave of the Korean immigrants is the third wave since 1965. It also had the Immigrations and Naturalizations Act, which it reworked the national quota system and made family unifications possible. And in the more detail, we will talk once again on the topic of law. And next, I think we need to look at the push factor. As we can see in this, the higher unemployment rate, political insecurity, and military dictatorships causes a massive number of Koreans to immigrate to the United States in 1960 to the early 1980s. Next, their children, largely known as the second generation, compose the present-day Korean American communities. Unlike the first and second wave of immigrants, who were primarily regular war victims, political refugees who had no choice but to immigrate. But these Korean immigrants were like the white-collar workers in Korea who volunteer moved to America.
Now let's move on from the history part and take a look at the stereotypes of Korean immigrants. The view of Korean immigrants as super immigrants or the mother of minority has also caused discord for them. Korean American success stories in business and education have led to the resentment from outside groups. These stereotypes have led to boycotts of Korean greengrocers in Brooklyn that the black rioters targeted Korean grocers, destroying countless Korean American businesses. So, we will talk more about this in the topic of Korean in Los Angeles. So next is the stereotype that we are familiar with. So we usually think that the Koreans eat kimchi with every meal. And all Koreans are obsessed with K-pop idols. And the Koreans are even obsessed with plastic surgery. These three stereotypes are in fact not only from American point of view, but mostly from all of the world. This may be because of how the Koreans present themselves and what they are famous for. But with those stereotypes, both positive and negative, how did they assimilate? Let's divide the early immigrants into two generations. The hope for the first generation Korean immigrant lies with their children's success in American society. Most immigrants work very hard to make a better living for themselves and for their children, while the second generation youth, despite the cultural confusion and never-ending battle with minority status, they try to adjust all aspects of American culture. The second generation assimilated much faster and with more ease than their first generation parents. Interestingly, despite the high level of assimilation, the second generation Korean youth display a strong social and psychological ethnic attachment to their Korean identity. Apart from that, another thing that helped them assimilate was the choice of friends and partners. Most of them still have Korean friends and dating partners. However, the second generation Korean youth accept white as close friends and also maintain close relationship with the Chinese students because of their cultural and physical similarities. And even better, many Korean American women seems to be comfortable dating non-Asian men. However, an overwhelming number of youth responded that the worst part of growing up in America is that they don't know where they come from, and they lost touch with their own language and culture. Even more than that, among first-generation immigrants, cultural assimilation were taking place. Korean food is still eaten at the principal meal of the day, but in the majority of the families, dinner is still Korean, while breakfast and lunch consist of cereals and sandwiches. So Koreans have come to prefer American food. About the holidays, the main holidays of the years are now the American occasions of Christmas, Easter, and Thanksgiving, and usually celebrated in the church. But in reality, we can see that Korean holidays are largely abandoned. Some families do observe the full moon day of August in the lunar calendar, but for this, they do nothing other than having dinner with friends. About language. After marriage and having babies, their children, which means the second generations, mostly barely can speak Korean because they spoke English instead. And the most obvious thing, dressing. Except for older women, most Korean immigrants do not wear traditional Korean dress because they say it's impractical as it is not machine washable and interferes with rapid motion. In Korea today, people wear such dresses only on special occasions. Koreans in America have abandoned it entirely. Many informants did not even have Korean clothing. Those who do wear them mainly for Christmas parties and sometimes for Thanksgiving or Easter party, which are usually held in Korean churches. So, Korean dress is not worn for the Korean New Year's Day, Full Moon Day, or even ancestor worship ceremonies. Well then, what are the difficulties that they faced, or what problems did they face? First, the difficulties in finding jobs. Even though Korean immigrants are characterized by high education and pre-immigrant occupational backgrounds, they have more language barriers than any other immigrant group with a similar level of education. For example, the Filipinos and Indian. Although most Korean immigrants learned English as a second language in Korean school, few of them were able to speak English fluently prior to the immigration. Unfortunately, this led them to not be able to find jobs comparable to their education. In fact, a large majority of the adult Korean immigrants with college education have to take blue-collar occupation. And the Korean faced racism, prejudice, and discrimination from whites and non-whites as the serious obstacle that they had to cope with. Most Korean small businesses are located within unprivileged communities and are therefore easy targets for frustration and anger. There are numerous incidents concerning victimization of Korean merchants by the underprivileged, who often turn to violence and crime as an outlet for their own problems. Of course, there are anti-Asian sentiments. This problem probably affects all Asian Americans. Anti-Asian sentiments first came in the US when Chinese and Japanese immigrants began arriving in the 19th century. Korean immigrants suffered discrimination but not specifically targeted until they reached a significant number of populations. Just like other Asians, Koreans were blamed for jobs because they were seen as stealing low-wages jobs. The next problem occurred specifically from Koreatown in Los Angeles. California was among the most popular destinations for those immigrants. Korean was one of the major new Asian ethnic groups of immigrants who have settled in Los Angeles. As a result, the Los Angeles Korean community has become not only the largest Korean center in the US, but also the largest overseas Korean center. The Los Angeles riots of the 1992 was the worst civil disturbance that exposed the deepening racial and class division in the US. The division between minority and majority, the immigrants and the natives, and even among the heterogeneous minority population led to distrust, fear, and violence. Even though the incident was mainly about African American people, the riots were motivated by anti-Korean sentiment among African Americans. Korean Americans' life in Los Angeles had been altered because of this historical event. The event resulted in the mass ransacking and destruction of Korean American-owned stores by African Americans. The riots had a profound economic, psychological, and ideological impact as a turning point, defining moment for 100 years of history of Korean immigration to the US, because the Korean Americans were among those who suffered the heaviest losses. Over 2,000 Korean American-owned stores have been looted, burned, or damaged. It was approximately around $400 million in losses. Korean Americans suffered a difficult situation of life that almost 40% of them were thinking about leaving Los Angeles, and most of them were facing financial problems. Some of them had to drop out of school and suffer psychological damage as a victim of the riots. The riots greatly impact their faith in the American dream and wonder about their goals and stability of living. However, the Korean Americans have gained much from this traumatic experience. They've learned many lessons of what it actually means to be a minority group in America. So with all these strugglings and difficulties, were there any laws specifically targeting them? The answer is no, not specifically for the Korean, but there are some laws that affect on the Korean immigrants. The first thing is the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. The first one is the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. The act was commonly known as McCarran-Walker Act, which upheld the national origins quota system established by the Immigration Act of 1924. It reinforced this controversial system of immigrant selection. It also ended Asian exclusion from immigrating to the United States and introduced a system of preferences based on the skill sets and family reunification. The act removed racial barriers that had excluded immigrants from nations, especially Asian nations that were assigned very small quotas. The 1952 Act created symbolic opportunities for Asian immigration, though in reality, it continued to discriminate against them. The law was to improve American relations with Asian nations. However, at the same time, it devised the new Asian quotas based on race instead of nationality. The next one is the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. The act revoked the national quota system and made family reunification possible. It recognized Americans' need for skilled professional workers. The government lifted the quota system and recruited experts and professionals from Asia. The third act is the Immigration Act of 1990. It made easier again for the professionals to eligible to immigration. The increasing number of status adjusters is due to globalization. From 1965 to 1990, South Korea was one of the main source countries of contemporary immigrants, next to Mexico and the Philippines. The number of immigrations from other Asian countries in the U.S. increased a lot due to the Immigration Act of 1990. Thus, during the second sub-period, South Korea was no longer one of the major source countries of contemporary immigrants. In fact, South Korea have succeeded to put in place a strong economy and get rid of their military dictatorship. So the country have less incentives to seek a better quality of life in the US. Moreover, the exposition to the media changed Koreans' perspective of the United States. It was no longer the land of prosperity and security, but a land where immigrants struggled to integrate and face discrimination. What about Korean culture in America? In Korean culture, food plays a significant role in building social relationships, especially in the manner in which Koreans eat. Thus, the Korean cuisine becomes a binding force between Korean and American culture and between people. Korean cuisine has assimilated in America, so it is now Korean American cuisine, which is a fusion of American and Korean taste and presentation. For example of this, although native Korean food does not include hamburgers, But here, Koreans have invented bulgogi burgers, which are meat burgers with a Korean twist, the grilled beef. So, if you walk into any restaurant in Koreatown, they will tell you that the majority of our customers are American. Another recognizable Korean culture is sport. Taekwondo was introduced in the US by several Koreans during the 1950s and the 60s. Taekwondo is Korean traditional martial art that teaches modern physical fighting skills. It is a discipline that shows ways of enhancing our spirit and life through training our body and mind. Today, it has become a global sport that has gained an international reputation and stands among the official games in the Olympics. However, mostly through demonstrations and training in the US, soldiers at various military. Since Taekwondo became well known throughout the 70s and 80s in America, Korean Taekwondo masters established their stronghold in various states, from the East Coast down to Florida to Midwest, out to the West Coast, and in the state of California. So, Taekwondo schools sprang up in every city in every state of the US now. Another unavoidable culture is holiday. Korean American Day on the January 13th commemorates the arrival of the first Korean immigrants to the United States in 1903. The day also honors the Korean American immense contributions of every aspect of society. Now let's move on to Korean American influences, which there are so many of them in all kinds of areas. Starting with these three remarkable people. The first Korean who became the American citizen, an activist for Korean independence, and the first Korean students in the US. Korean American built a critical mass of political engage that organized around immigrant rights issues and succeeded in establishing a Korean American voice at the national level. The transformation of political agency within the Korean American community significantly impacted immigrant-related legislation, and furthermore, the political processes used by the Korean American community contribute to the development of new concepts on social change organizing that are relevant to the changing demographics and diversity of ethnic and immigrant communities in the American diaspora. In political field, there are so many remarkable Korean American. Syngman Rhee, he came to the US in 1904 and earned a bachelor's degree at George Washington University in 1907, and a master's degree at Harvard University and a PhD from Princeton University in 1910. After that, he went back to Korea and became a political activist and the first Republic of Korea or South Korean president. The next one is Herbert Choi. Herbert was the first Asian American who served as a United States federal judge and the first person of Korean ancestry to be admitted to the bar of the US. His parents were Korean immigrants who came to Hawaii to work on sugar plantations. After graduating Harvard University, Choi joined the US Army following the attack on Pearl Harbor and entered the Army as the lieutenant and left as a captain. After serving in both Japan and Korea, Won Jae-kim, he is the first immigrant to serve as Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, and is the first Korean American ever to become Assistant Attorney General. In business field, Do Won-chang is one of the best-known Korean American to be successful in America. He is the founding of the clothing retail store Forever 21, which has branches all over the world and turns over billions in sales every year. He started in 1984 using the wages from his 3 jobs. Do-won Chung was able to open his first store in Highland Park areas of Los Angeles. He called it Fashion 21 and targeted it towards his fellow Korean Americans. Chung changed the name of his store to Forever 21 to appeal to more customers. This clearly worked, as he was then able to open more stores in the US and even in his hometown. He even said that Forever 21 gives hope and inspiration to people who come here with almost nothing, and that is a reward that humbles me. The fact that immigrants coming in America, much like I did, can come into a Forever 21 and know that all this was started by a simple Korean immigrant with a dream. Another successful businessman is Charlie Sheen. He is the founder of Charlie's Philly Steak. Actually, it is kind of amazing how a Korean immigrant amassed a food empire by serving an American favorite. Charlie's Philly Steak's founder and CEO Charlie Sheen tasted his first Philly cheesesteak back in 1985 while attending the Ohio State University. As a young undergrad, with an appetite for success, Sheen knew he wanted to share this sandwich experience with others in a big way. With nearly 600 locations in 46 states and in 17 countries around the world, Charlie's can be found in retail shopping centers, airport, strip centers, and even Army and Air Force bases worldwide. What about sports? Vicky Hurst. Many people are not aware that young golf superstar Vicky Hurst is an American soul sister. In fact, her mother is Korean and her father was a Caucasian American. Honestly, her parents were both avid golfers. In fact, her mother was playing golf while pregnant with Vicky when her water broke on the 16th hole. She was winning too. Another one is Kevin Kim. Kevin Kim is an American retired tennis player. Korean American Kevin Kim was born under Korean parents who immigrated to the US in 1960s. He entered the top 100 in 2004, reaching a career high single ranking of world number 63 in March 2005. Well, let's move on to a more interesting area of art and design. Jim Lee is a Korean American comic book artist, writer, editor, and publisher. He is currently the publisher of the chief creative officers of DC Comics. In recognition of his work, Lee has received a Harley Award, Inkpart Award, and 3 Wizard Fan Awards. He entered in the industry in 1987 as an artist for Marvel Comics, illustrating titles such as Alpha Fight and The Punisher's War Journal, before gaining popularity on the Uncanny X-Men, the first one on the 1991 spin-off series. Another one is Peter Shawn. Peter is an American animator, film director, storyboard artist, and voice actor at Pixar Animation Studios. Besides his regular jobs, he was also the physical models for Retro from Up and Squishy from Monster University, the latter of whom he provided the voice for. He made his director debut with The Good Dinosaur. He was involved in the making of several famous films, including Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, Wall-E, Up, Toy Story 3, and Monster University. Another well-known field for Korean American is journalist. Lee An Kim is a first-generation Korean American who was an usher and general assignment reporter for KGTV Channel 10, the San Diego, California ABC television affiliate. She has received numerous awards for her work, including an Emmy Award for investigative reporting, the California Teachers Association Award for Best Educational Reporting for her coverage of bilingual education, and Best News Report by California Chicano News Media Association, and the two National Asian American Journalists Association Awards for Best Reporting in Asian and non-Asian related issues. Another person is Juju Shang, who was born in Seoul, South Korea and raised in Northern California. She is an Emmy Award-winning co-author of ABC News Nightline. She also reports regularly for Good Morning America and 2020. Shang has been recognized for her in-depth personal narrative set against the backdrop of pressing national and international news. She has traveled around the world to report on global issues and on gender-based violence, including a trip to Central Africa on the front lines against Boko Haram and Bring Back Our Girls #. Moving on to the field of artists, Philip Ahn was one of the best-known Asian American actors in Hollywood. He played 100 of Chinese and Japanese characters during his long career. Ironically, he was the son of Korean patriot who spent most of his life resisting Japanese domination in his country. Philip played over 100 of American films and series including The Match, Hawaii Five-0, The Shanghai Stories, and Mae West. Another one is my favorite, Ki Hong Lee, or Min-ho. Min-ho is one of the most well-known Korean American into film that pushes himself from simple Korean American life to be a superstar when everyone can pronounce his Korean name without having to change it. He said that the Korean, they really paved the way. Every role that they got, every room that they were in to represent the community, they've all paved the way for people like me and future kids. He even admired the current immigrants that we are a minority, and whenever someone is in limelight, he or she is a representative automatically. If I can inspire some people along the way, that would be nice. Lee began his career by taking booking guest spots on shows like Modern Family and New Girl. Lee landed his big break in 2014 as Min-ho, athletic, headstrong leader of a group of teenagers trying to escape a hazard trap in the sci-fi franchise The Maze Runner. He also inspired other non-American like him to honor themselves, because it is a long way for him to be this far, and he encouraged no one to give up. Talking about Korea, it is impossible not to mention about K-pop. All these Korean American girls are undeniably famous because of her group Girl Generation. Tiffany, Crystal, and Jessica were American-born, and they migrated to start their career in South Korea. There are also other American-born Korea. Samuel from Produce 101 was born in Los Angeles, California, to Mexican-American father and a South Korean mother. So he is American-born but South Korean singer. Another one is Jay Park. Jay Park is an American rapper, singer, songwriter, record producer, dancer, actor, and member of the Seattle-based b-boy crew Art of Movement, and the founder and CEO of the independent hip-hop record labels AOM Gang. Park rose to fame as the leader of South Korean boy band 2PM, formed by record label JYP Entertainment in 2008. Even as a famous and successful singer, he felt the threat of being not 100% pure American, as he told CNN during a recent interview that, "Me being Asian American, I was always looked at as an outsider. I always had to fight for my place." And it was mentioned that Jay Park has clearly become an icon for those struggling to make a name for themselves. It shows that Asia is not being ignored. You can be an R&B singer, a rapper, a singer from Asia and have ambitions to take over a global market, you can be recognized by the grades. Jay Park is one of the first and only Asian artists signed to Jay-Z label Roc Nation. In case you're unaware, K-pop industry is gradually influenced the US. K-pop sensation BTS has become the first all-South Korean act to rule the top American single chart Billboard with their English language song Dynamite hitting #1. It is another milestone cementing the 7-member boy band global dominance. Coming hour after BTS beat American heavyweights including Lady Gaga, Ariana Grande, and Taylor Swift to score the Best Pop Award at Sunday's MTV Video Music Awards. BTS became the first K-pop group to speak at the United Nations in an effort to empower young people. They gave a speech about empowerment and love. Therefore, we can see that the first fanbase of BTS in the United States and BTS albums have hit #1 on Billboard album charts and US streaming, radio airplay, and digital sales data on ranked the top hits. Blackpink is also tearing down the walls of K-pop to officially make a statement in the United States. Blackpink's single How You Like That on June 26, 2020 broke the Guinness World Record for the most YouTube views in 24 hours period with 86.3 million in its first day. As we can see in these pictures, Blackpink girls recently caught the attention of celebrities around the world. However, Will Smith, who played in Men in Black and Aladdin, was one of the first to meet this full performance. And this is also the photo of Ariana Grande and Blackpink in Coachella. Lady Gaga teamed up with Blackpink for Sour Candy. It wasn't just one of the year's most high-profile collaborations. It was also a full circle moment for the members of the K-pop quartet who studied Lady Gaga's music during their time as pop star trainees. And the latest collaboration between Korean and American music is the song called Ice Cream, released on August 20th, 2020. It is Blackpink and Selena Gomez collaboration. The lyrics are mixed between English and Korean. Ice Cream debuted and peaked at number 13 on US Billboard Hot 100, so that becoming Blackpink's first single to peak inside the top 20 of the chart. If you feel like this is too much already, but it's not. There are many more Korean entertainment in American media. Major American companies are buying television programs from South Korea shows that have received a lot of respect internationally as American people are saying Korean content is fun and creative. The South Korean drama series Good Doctor, which was remade for American television in 2017 and this February was renewed for a 4th season. Likewise, The Masked Singer, an adaptation of a Korean singing contest show, premiered in the US and has versions in countries as far afield as Australia and Mexico. With all this gorgeous performance, it's impossible not to mention about Trump. In 2019, the more interesting meeting is when the American President Donald Trump travels to Seoul to meet with President Moon Jae-in in the final day of G20 summit. When he arrived, though, at the Blue House, the South Korean presidential office, Moon brought the K-pop group EXO to welcome him.